Today I'm going to talk about, of course, Napoleon, Age of Napoleon that dominates Europe in pretty much the early 1800s. I'll kind of get into how Napoleon rise to power, seized control of France and Europe, and then of course we'll talk about the Napoleonic Wars, which were really one of the bloodiest conflicts that would occur, of course, in modern Europe at the time. So I'll get into that. So if you have any comments, questions, about the lecture, let me know in the live stream, or you can always leave me comments, of course, questions on my channel. So anyway, from last time I had talked about how, the French Revolution had pretty much overthrown the Bourbon regime. And of course, France went through a lot of reforms in the country. And then, of course, what happened was the Jacobins took over, the radicals that like Maximilian Robespierre and all that. And then what's going to happen, of course, under the Directory government that kind of comes in at the end of the French Revolution, you're going to see the rise of Napoleon Bonaparte, who, of course, was a very famous, not just a general, but you'll see a very famous French statesman as well. So I'm going to talk first a little bit about, of course, the early life of Napoleon. We'll kind of get into, the background of Napoleon, like who he was and all that. Napoleon was born in the 1760s. 1769 is about when he was born, died 1821. I think he only lived about 51 years, if you know Napoleon. And Napoleon Bonaparte, by the way, was not really French. He, of course, later would become like a Frenchman. But if you know about the origins of Napoleon, he was actually born on the island of Corsica, which is now part of France today. And it's believed that the background of Napoleon is primarily from Italian descent. I think they say his family, the Bonaparte family, originated from somewhere in the northern part of Italy. I think likely around Tuscany. I think where they originate from. And Napoleon is not, like I said later, not just a military genius. He's this modern general. He's going to be considered one of the first major modern generals of this time. He helps to really change warfare in Europe afterwards. Later, he's a statesman, like the head of the French government. And then in 1804, he also reigned as emperor. So he was later known as Emperor Napoleon I. He later has a nephew that will reign too as emperor, which is Napoleon III, which we'll get to later, I think, later in the week. Napoleon was a pretty good general. Like if you look at his military career, which lasted close to 30 years, Napoleon's win record, like his win-loss record, was almost 90%. Like not quite, but almost. And most of his battles he lost were more into the end of his career. Now I'm going to kind of get into some of the early, life of Napoleon. So you can see he was born to kind of a aristocratic family on the island of Corsica. That's an earlier painting of Napoleon you see on the right there. He later attended a bunch of schools, of course, in France, northern France, by the 1780s. So you can kind of see his rapid descent through, of course, the French army. A lot of it had to do with, of course, the French Revolution. I think without the French Revolution, Napoleon would not have been, of course, very successful. Napoleon, by the way, was later had nicknames. You probably heard about this before, but he was later known as nicknames like the Little Corporal, which was more of a terms of endearment that his troops would call him, because he was kind of seen as almost like being one of theirs. Like a non-commissioned officer or something like that. And then I think when he became emperor later, they called him the Little Emperor or Petit Empereur. It's kind of a myth that Napoleon was short, by the way. I think he was only average height, 5'6", but obviously wasn't very tall. That was his parents right there. You see in that picture, his father, named Carlo Bonaparte, was believed to be like a Corsican lawyer. And then that's his mother on the right, Letizia. Letizia, of course, he was very more closer with. I think he kind of saw his father as more of a scoundrel, but he saw his mother as being really the one that was the head of the family. And I think he once said that she had the head of a man, but the heart of a woman. Was the kind of the joke he said. But I think he owed a lot to his mother more than anything, taught him a lot of things about life in general, and why he was such a great person later. That's their family home, by the way, Ajaccio, Corsica, where he, I guess, grew up when he was young. But his father later sent him to military schools, of course, in France. Later in his life, of course, when he was a teenager, he would attend that famous school you're looking at, which is the École Militaire, which was at the time the Bourbons' main military academy, where they pretty much groomed officers for the French military. It's kind of like today, still kind of considered like the French is like West Point for their military, so it kind of comparable to that. And it's believed that Napoleon graduated from that academy at the age of 16 with the French artillery, as we started with. He was only a second lieutenant, so he kind of started on the bottom as an officer overall. So considered one of the greatest military careers, by the way, in history. It would only take Napoleon about 8 years, by the way, to go from second lieutenant all the way to like a brigadier general. This is just 8-year period. But a lot of it was because of the combination of the French Revolution and the French Revolutionary Wars that were kind of going on at the time. Of course, talk a little bit about the military career of Napoleon. A lot of it was owed to different, military events that happened during the French Revolutionary Wars. Napoleon just happened to be at the right place at the right time. That kind of helped him to, move up in the French military. One of his first great successes was the siege of Toulon, which happened in December of 1793. That was when the British had come into the French port of Toulon on the Mediterranean Sea and laid siege to it with their fleet. And Napoleon, who was a captain at the time in the French military, the artillery, came up with an ingenious plan, which was to storm the heights of Toulon and then fire cannon at the British ships that were in the harbor. And so he was basically able to drive the British fleet out at that point. And so because of that, he was promoted afterwards to brigadier general. So that's how he got promoted to becoming a general. And so Napoleon just happened to be at the right time, and I think at first they would listen to what he wanted to do militarily, but they realized that he had some kind of knowledge. Then, of course, the other thing that they talk about sometimes that, also helped his career as well, there was a deal where in 1795 in the fall, the Constitutional Convention was meeting for what would be the Directory government that was forming at that point, at the end of the French Revolution. And there was a case where mobs of pro-royalists were attempting to storm it to maybe put the monarch back in power. And so apparently he was the only general in town in Paris. And so they got him out. And of course, Napoleon was, like I said, expert with artillery. And so he used basically artillery on the mobs to quell, this possible revolt. I think it was Thomas Carlyle in his famous book, The French Revolution of History, which by the way was one of the first historical works written on the French Revolution at the time, said the famous comment about this, that Napoleon used a whiff of grape shot, basically to do this. And that led, after that, Napoleon becoming full general after that. So then, of course, if you know about this, Napoleon also met what is Josephine. If you know about her, her real name is Josephine de Beauharnais. Well, actually, she was called Rose, but Napoleon called her Josephine. And she was the former mistress of Paul Barras, one of the directors, in the Directory government that was running. And so that was kind of important about that. A little bit about her. Josephine was a French Creole. She had been born in the Caribbean on the island of Martinique. Her husband had died on the guillotine, so she was a widow. But she had a lot of influence in the actual French government. So they think that that's part of why Napoleon was able to rise to power because of her influence. And I think she married him because she needed like someone to support her financially or whatever. And she was actually a few years older than him, which is true about that. And I think there's a debate about if she really liked him or not, because if you know about it, Josephine cheated on Napoleon several times. And but Napoleon had many, mistresses. I forget how many he had, girlfriends, mistresses, but it was, I think, over 30 or something at one point. Later, he had a second wife, and she'll be later his first empress consort, 1804 to 1810. Napoleon later does have a second wife he marries, which is Marie Louise, who is the Duchess of Parma. She was the daughter of the Emperor of Austria, which was Francis II. He was Holy Roman Emperor as well. And he'll be later his father-in-law. It's kind of a tragic story about that, but later in the Napoleonic Wars, they end up, fighting each other in the Napoleonic Wars. But she was the only one that gave Napoleon a legitimate son, which was Napoleon II. He was called, and but Napoleon called Napoleon II the little eaglet, little eagle. And I think he died young, if you know about that, Napoleon II, which was 21. He was later called Emperor Napoleon II, but he never really reigned. Right, let me talk about what happened next. Now, what happened, of course, at this point was that Napoleon was then given command of a new army to basically fight in the French Revolutionary Wars, which I think Paul Barras was behind there on that picture on the right. And he was commanding this army that was called the Army of Italy from 1796 to 97. And he used this army to cross the Alps into northern Italy and fight against Austria primarily. And there's also this other state called Sardinia, the Kingdom of Sardinia or Piedmont Sardinia, which was in the northwestern part of Italy in the Alps. And this was all part of the so-called First Coalition that was fighting France at the time and the French Revolutionary Wars. Britain, Austria, the Holy Roman Empire, Prussia, Sardinia, the Dutch, all these different countries were arrayed against France, the French Republic at the time. And Napoleon was actually very successful in this Italian campaign, which mostly happened in 1796, where he fought them up in the Alps. And in several battles, Napoleon just clobbered the coalition side, defeating, I think, first the Piedmont Sardinian side, and then he drove the Austrians back into Austria, drove them out of Italy, pretty much. And the Austrians had never seen a general like Napoleon. He was just this modernized general that fought new kinds of tactics that they'd never seen before. He wouldn't just attack them in the middle. He would attack their flanks. He would try to attack them in the rear. Napoleon just kept coming at them. He would attack any kind of conditions. If it was raining, snowing, whatever, nighttime, he would attack them. I think usually in the old days, if you got an army in check, they would just let the general back off, but not in this case. He would go after him instead. There is a battle called the Battle of Lodi, you see there, May 10th, 1796. It's after that battle that Napoleon really starts to become a legend, and a lot of his troops start calling him the Little Corporal. And so 1796, I want to say up to about 1812, 1813, Napoleon's almost unbeatable on the battle. He loses very few battles, a period of like 15 years. There was a treaty, of course, I'll go into a little bit. They had this thing called the Treaty of Campo Formio, of course, October 1797, that ended the First Coalition War, which eventually Britain will kind of be the only power fighting that. And so that's going to force Napoleon to eventually, like with the French, create new tactics to try to knock the British out of the war. I'll get to Italy later, but there'll be a kingdom of Italy that'll kind of emerge in northern Italy because Austria's not there anymore. That won't be until a little later when that happens. Napoleon had this idea with the French to invade Egypt, which, if you know about this, the British traded a lot with India and the Ottoman Empire in the East. And so they wanted to try to destroy a lot of their trade routes that went from, pretty much Europe to the Middle East to India. And so this was all part of another conflict they called, that was part of the French Revolutionary Wars. That was the so-called War of the Second Coalition. That began like in the summer, they think, of 1798. And so about 40,000 troops, Napoleon landed forces in what is Egypt. I'll get to Horatio Nelson. He's kind of pivotal in that campaign as well on the British side. That's there. Napoleon has about 40,000 troops that they bring with the French Navy, which they land in the delta of basically where the Nile is in Egypt, modern Egypt today. And in Egypt at the time, Egypt was defended by these forces that were called Mamluks, which were mercenaries of the Ottoman Empire. And they couldn't match, Napoleon's forces. And on July 21st, 1798, Napoleon's forces just crushed their armies at the Battle of the Pyramids. July 21st, 1798, which took place near Cairo. And then from there, Napoleon was able to then march on basically was Cairo had taken. And so he would occupy Egypt and later part of Syria from 1798 to 99. However, if you know what happened, Napoleon's forces, though, was his navy was badly defeated when he was in I think part of the Delta. And in August, I think August 1st to August 3rd, Horatio Nelson, who had been trying to search for basically the French's naval force, sailed into the delta of the Nile basin and trapped his forces and sank or destroyed most of the fleet. Something like about 13 ships or so were either captured or destroyed by the British. And it was either called the Battle of the Nile, which is what the British called it, or I think the French called it the Battle of Abercrombie, which is in the Nile Delta. And Nelson became a big hero, of course, after that. Horatio Nelson, you go back up here, of course, was a big figure, in the naval aspect of the Napoleonic Wars. He would later be known as Lord Nelson, of course, or Admiral Nelson as well. He would later be pivotal also in the Battle of Trafalgar in 1805 as well. So yeah, that was the only thing about that with this, of course, fleet being trapped. Pretty much his whole army's trapped in France after that because of this. Napoleon does have this deal where, if you know about it, he did actually go up into if you kind of study about Napoleon's forces, he does actually invade Syria. He had this idea, they think, to maybe conquer Palestine and maybe emancipate the Jews in Europe and allow them to live there as a homeland. It was kind of an idea he had. This would also help to hurt the British trade routes also in that region, but that actually failed later. His armies were unable to take the city of Accra, which I think was in northern Israel at the time today. And then his troops were riddled with bubonic plague as well, which was, of course, another problem, of course, as well. Of course, the most famous thing they always talk about with Napoleon in Egypt, his troops discovered what later became known as the Rosetta Stone, which was found by this French soldier named Pierre-Francois Bouchard, who found it in this fort in the delta part of the Nile Basin. A little town called Rosetta. It was found actually within a fort called Fort Julian. And he pulled it out, and it was like a half-ton stone that had an inscription on it from the time of the Ptolemaic dynasty in ancient Egypt. And so with that, within a few years, within I think 2 decades or so, eventually the French were able to, one of the first to translate the Rosetta Stone. A man named Jean-Francois Champollion, which you see in that picture there. And Champollion was the one that would translate it first, I think around 1822. And that would be very important later because they think that the early discoveries of Napoleon in Egypt, they think spawned the whole study of Egyptology later, like real big interest in the study of ancient Egypt, et cetera. And so some people think Napoleon helped to start that afterwards because he brought like all kinds of people with him, artists, scientists, engineers, to study ancient Egypt. And they even wrote a kind of a study that they kind of published later that was called the Description of Egypt. And Napoleon really thought that there were secrets about Egypt that they could learn. I think he once remarked to his soldiers that soldiers, 40 centuries look down upon you. I think he was talking about this famous Sphinx and all that. That's in Egypt with the pyramids. And they began studying like the pyramids and all that. So that's one thing that Napoleon is kind of famous for, of course, with that. Now, what happens, of course, later, Napoleon eventually returns to France in 1799. And as you saw, of course, in that little short video, with a military, he's using the military pretty much. Napoleon would eventually overthrow the French Directory government, the so-called coup of 18 Brumaire, because remember, they're still using that old French revolutionary calendar at the time, which I think the actual official date is November 9th, 1799 is when it's at. And so he uses people that are actually in the government to overthrow the kind of coup within a coup, like I said, to overthrow the government. At first, it was going to be like a government of shared power with several politicians, but Napoleon then basically takes over the government and it becomes more like a dictatorship. And so they really think that when Napoleon seizes power in 1799, that really signals like the end of the French Revolution at that point. And Napoleon once remarked that I am the revolution. That's what he said. And so they think it continues, but more or less he says, yeah, I'm the one that's the revolution itself now. All right. Now you can see there when he takes power under this government, it's later known as the French consulate. That's the actual official nickname they actually call the Republican government that Napoleon rules with. He rules as different titles. His main title was First Consul of France, which at first he was elected to, I believe, a period of like 10 years, which was in 1799, which was through a plebiscite with the French people. But in 1802, it became Council for Life, is what it is. Which these are all done through elections, through plebiscites, of course. And then, of course, 2 years later, of course, what happened? The French people elected to make him Emperor of France in 1804. And so that's going to eventually lead into, of course, him seizing power and becoming basically a monarch, Emperor Napoleon I, which we'll talk about later. But before I get into that, I did want to talk about the fact that Napoleon was known for making reforms to the country. He wasn't just, this general that was later an emperor of France. He was known as a statesman that really tried to reform the country based on the Enlightenment, the Revolution, and things like that. And probably his biggest legacy in France today that's still around, it's even Louisiana today, of course, our state, that's the Napoleonic Code, or the Code Napoleon, as they called it. The official name is actually the Civil Code of 1804, which a bunch of jurists drew up before that. So I think they started working on it right after he took power. And the Napoleonic Code is a French civil law code system that was developed under Napoleon, signed by him into law in 1804. And a lot of it was based on this ideas of the Enlightenment, like I said, in the ideals of the French Revolution, but it was heavily influenced by the Justinian Code that went back to the Byzantine Empire, Eastern Roman Empire, going back to Emperor Justinian back in the sixth century. And this code influenced a lot of European law code systems throughout Europe. It really did. And in Louisiana, as you know, this state is very unique because our law code systems are heavily influenced by the Napoleonic Code compared to most, about most states in the United States. They're based on English common law and things like that. But ours is more based on the Napoleonic Code and even some Spanish influences also as well. That's why when you take the bar exam in Louisiana, it's more difficult because of the Napoleonic Code. Napoleon also enacted education reform. So he founded schools called later lycées, which were originally for boys, for like secondary schools, which would be like mostly middle school, high school type schools, basically. And later it was also for girls added as well. So that's something he did too, trying to reform education and make it more compulsory on things like that in the country. I did create a national bank, which is true, like around 1800. I think the Swiss kind of helped set it up basically in France. But the Banque de France, or Banque de France, they call it now, I guess, French, is still around. That corporation today still exists. It's been around for over 200 something years. The Bank of France. That was important because that helped stabilize their currency, end a lot of inflation in the country, things like that overall. Then he restored the Catholic Church. That's one thing that's very famous as well, with the Concordat of 1801, which he made with the Pope at the time, which was Pope Pius VII. And this particular agreement made that, the Catholicism the main religion of France again. But in France, anyone could practice any religion. So people had freedom of religion. And if you know about Napoleon, he was pretty much one of the first major rulers of Europe to start emancipating like Jews and other kinds of people. I think he didn't have too many negative things to even say about Islam, believe it or not, Napoleon. So, also another thing that Napoleon did, which I think indirectly he did, if you know about this, the French had developed the metric system, if you know about that, in Europe. And that system later spread throughout Europe, which a lot of it was due to like French conquests and during the Napoleonic Wars and all that. And that'll become more important as a measurement system more than the British measurement system, the imperial system that they have, today overall. And so basically, the meter, the gram, the liter, things like that become, the basic measurements that you have in Europe instead of the inch, foot, ounce, pound, or things like that. So overall. Oh, and there's one more thing I do admit that's still around today that Napoleon also created, which is the Legion of Honor, which he founded as well. And this was a type of merit system that he created to honor like citizens of France that did good for the country, soldiers that were brave in battle and things like that. And it was a system that was created to kind of get rid of like, noble titles and things like that. And it had like 5 ranks to it, by the way, which the highest rank was the Grand Master, which the president of France holds today. And you were given rewards like money for achieving a certain rank, and then also medals, which president of France usually is the one that has the Grand Cross, which is the highest medal that you could, of course, achieve. Now, Napoleon, as you know, is eventually, coronated as Emperor of France. Happened on December 2nd, 1804. Of course, very famously happened in Notre Dame, famous cathedral in Paris that burned in 2019. Most kings weren't crowned there, by the way. They're crowned at that other, I think there's another Notre Dame cathedral that's also cathedral that's in the eastern part of France. But anyway, that ceremony was kind of controversial, if you know about it. In the ceremony, the Pope was there to like anoint, Napoleon and crown him. And in the middle of the ceremony, he took the crown from the Pope's hands and he put it on his head. And then he put the crown on his wife's head, of course, to make her Empress Consort, but it was actually planned to do it. But I think Napoleon made this remark once that he said that I found the crown of France in the gutter. I picked up my sword and I put it on my head. That's the famous quote or something like that. So So anyway, but yeah, Josephine is also, like I said, she's crowned as his empress, and she'll be his empress consort until 18, I think 1810. It is. So there's Napoleon. Of course, on the right, you see Napoleon kind of dressed as like he's like a Caesar or emperor, of course. Here's, of course, him on the left, more dressed as like a general. You can see the Grand Cross. You see on the left side of his chest there, like close to his left arm, you can see the Grand Cross, which is that medal that the Grand Master would receive, now the President of France. Now, the only thing about Napoleon was that Napoleon, when he got crowned emperor, it spawned a bunch of these wars they now call the Napoleonic Wars, which really start as far back as 1803. They think go up to like 1814, 1815. And these wars, by the way, were the series of bloody conflicts, which were considered some of the bloodiest conflicts of really the 19th century that you have. It's because of the fact that they think that close to 3 million soldiers or more may have died fighting throughout Europe, against Napoleon or for Napoleon also as well. And so I think there's not too many other conflicts that are as bloody. I think you got the Crimean War that was fought kind of in the 1850s. Yeah, the American Civil War was pretty bloody in the United States in the 1860s. I think maybe the Franco-Prussian War was another war that was kind of bloody as well, but they don't really stack up, as violent, as this one was, of course. And it took place over a long period of time overall, because like a lot of those other wars were kind of short compared to these wars. Part of why the wars were fought was because Europe, there was a bunch of coalitions that were arrayed against Napoleon. Britain, Prussia, Russia, Austria, the Holy Roman Empire, Sweden, Spain, and a few others at one point. Portugal opposed the French Empire. And almost got to the point where everybody was opposing his empire. It's kind of like what happened with Hitler. Hitler was ganged up by a bunch of allies against him, and he had some alliances, but they were kind of weak with him. And but Britain was the major power that really kept the Napoleonic Wars going. They're the ones that pretty much put up most of the money, of course, to fight against Napoleon overall. Here's kind of a map showing you, by the way, on the left there. You can see all the territories at one point that Napoleon either took over or states that were under Napoleon's control. So good chunk of Europe from like Spain, Portugal, France, through Germany, all the way to Poland at one point were under his control. And also Italy, Kingdom of Italy at one point formed during that time period as well. And part of why Napoleon was unbeatable during that period was Napoleon devised this army that was called La Grande Armée, which of course stood for the Great Army, which Napoleon liked to call a lot of things great. Like his empire, the Napoleonic Empire, was usually called the First French Empire, traditionally, but he called it the Grand Empire or Great Empire of Napoleon. So that's what he preferred to call his empire. But this army peaked at close to about 800,000 troops overall. It was considered, by the way, one of the greatest armies at the time, like in modern times. It was unbeatable for many years. Anyway, part of why Napoleon was able to, conquer so much territory and be so successful militarily was because in 1803, if you know about this, the French had obtained Louisiana from the Spanish in 1800. And so Napoleon had this idea to conquer the New World also as well. But what happened was they had this thing called the Haitian Revolution that broke out in Haiti, in the Caribbean. And he lost Haiti. And so he decided to sell Louisiana. He didn't want to give it to the British, who were in Canada. And so he sold it to the United States. You know about this so-called Louisiana Purchase, 1803. And he sold it for $15 million. And that money is going to be pretty important, by the way, because he'll use it to develop the Grand Army to fight the coalitions in Europe overall. By the way, the United States acquired the total area of Louisiana Purchase for, it was 828,000 square miles, or if you want acres, it's 530 million acres. That's a lot of land, which I think at the time was around maybe 2 or 3 cents an acre, which I think in modern times it was, I think, equivalent to like 40 to 50 cents now, but pretty good land purchase that we made with that. And it, as you know, doubled the United States, the size of it, of course, afterwards. Now, Napoleon, of course, had this idea, of course, which was to try to defeat the British, to knock them out of the war. Of course, I'm going to get to the Battle of Austerlitz in a second with that. But there's going to be a bunch of these conflicts that are going to break out. There's two of them. They have the wars of the third. The War of the Third Coalition was the first, I think, war of the really Napoleonic Wars that break out in 1805-06. And then you also had the Fourth Coalition in 1807 that was also as well. However, if you study about it, Napoleon had this idea to try and defeat Britain first. I think it was even his plan where he marched his Grand Army to the northern part of France, and he was going to try to somehow cross the English Channel to take England. And he had different ideas. Like I think he had this idea to build a tunnel under the English Channel. I think he also was going to have this idea to use hot air balloons, where they were going to kind of sail over, the English Channel and try to land there and conquer it. And neither of those really panned out. And so his other option was to combine the French and the Spanish. I think Spain was kind of still, supportive of France at that point, 1805, the Bourbons. And so anyway, they combined their naval forces, and they were going to try to take control of the English Channel and then maybe take England after that. However, what happened was the British Navy under Lord Nelson attacked their fleet off of what is called Cape Trafalgar, the Battle of Trafalgar, of course. And they defeated actually a much larger naval force than theirs. And Nelson was killed in the battle, but it was considered to be one of the greatest naval victories of the whole war for the coalition side in the Napoleonic Wars. And so Napoleon really never actually, was able to invade Britain. And so that was kind of one of the things that really was a thorn in his side, not being able to defeat the British. Same thing with Hitler, too, in World War II as well. Well, Napoleon, one of the things he's going to do next, he's not able to defeat the British at that point, and so he instead invades Austria to the east in Germany, and that begins the so-called Alm Campaign, which happened in the fall/winter of 1805, and quickly, in a matter of something like 3 weeks, between September and October of 1805, Napoleon's force just routs the Austrian forces with his Grand Army, and he actually takes the capital of Vienna by November 1805 at that point. And so one of the things that happens is the Russians come in under Alexander I, Emperor of Russia, and they decide to, combine their forces to try and see if they could defeat Napoleon at this point. And so they're able to muster something like 90-something thousand troops at what would be the Battle of Austerlitz, which happened on December 2nd, 1805. Austerlitz was fought in now what is called the Czech Republic. And this battle had a nickname. It was later dubbed the Battle of the Three Emperors because of the fact that you had three emperors present in the battle. Napoleon, who was, of course, Emperor of France, but you also had the Emperor of Austria, and Holy Roman Emperor Francis II, and then also Tsar Alexander I, or Emperor Alexander I, who was the ruler of Russia. So that's basically why it was referred to as being called the Battle of the Three Emperors. And this battle is very important. The Battle of Austerlitz is considered to be really Napoleon's greatest military victory. And even though outnumbered in the battle, Napoleon's forces inflicts heavy casualties on the Russian Austrian forces, who get like routed, basically. Like 2/3 of their forces was either captured or killed or wounded in the battle. And Russian Austrian forces suffered something like 36,000 casualties in the battle, almost half their army, not quite. And then the French only had 8,000 casualties. It was such a rout called Austerlitz. And Austerlitz is a battle which was kind of this famous battle that's really compared with battles in ancient history, like Gaugamela, I think, is one you may have heard of, or the Battle of Cannae, which Hannibal was famous for. Later, Napoleon would commission the Arc de Triomphe in Paris being built, which would later be built to honor a lot of the soldiers that fought and died, not only in the French Revolutionary Wars, but in the Napoleonic Wars. And later, they also added a tomb of the unknown soldier, which was put there, who died in World War I. And so that's a very famous landmark today, of course, in Paris. But I don't think it was completed later until, I want to say, the 1830s. But it was basically an idea that he put there originally, like a victory arch celebrating battles like Austerlitz. All right, yeah. So anyway, I'm going to, of course, move on to talk about, of course, other battles later. Now, they do have different things that happen afterwards because of that. Because of the fact that Austria gets defeated in 1805, that leads to the collapse of the Holy Roman Empire by 1806. And so afterwards, Francis II becomes Emperor of Austria, I think is his official title that he goes by later. And Napoleon creates this buffer state that kind of replaces the Holy Roman Empire, which will be called the Confederation of the Rhine, through this treaty called the Treaty of Pressburg, which was signed, I think, by 06. Anyway, what it does, it creates a buffer state between Prussia and Austrian Empire in Central Europe and France in the West. And then also Napoleon takes over Italy. He'll form a kingdom there called the Kingdom of Italy as well. Now, Prussia kind of is concerned about this. They decide to declare war on France, which was actually a bad idea. And so then Napoleon just marched his Grand Army northward towards Berlin. And so I think it's in October of 1806, Napoleon's forces basically routs the Prussian forces under Frederick William III at two battles, one called Jena, another battle called Arstadt. And after that, Napoleon then takes their capital as well. And that's kind of bad for them. Prussia's going to get knocked out of the war at that point. And they won't fight in the war again until 1813. So Prussia getting involved in the war was probably not a good idea at that point. And a lot of their soldiers will be forced to be enlisted into a lot of Napoleon's armies that fight in Europe afterwards. Now, there's Russia left, of course, in Europe at that point to fight Napoleon. So Napoleon pushes eastward to fight against Alexander's forces, like in part of East Prussia and Poland. And they fight one pivotal battle, which I think now is where Kaliningrad is in northern Central Europe, which is the Battle of Friedland, which happened on June 14th, 1807. And Alexander's forces are routed in that battle, like losing over 40% of his forces. And so it's at that point that Alexander realized that he has to basically capitulate, of course, with Napoleon. And so that ended pretty much most of the conflicts at that point between those different coalitions. The third and the fourth coalition wars pretty much came to an end. Now, they do sign a treaty between them, which is true, which was called the Peace of Tilsit, was signed in July of 1807. I think one was signed in the middle of a river called the River Niemen, in the middle of a raft, where actually Alexander I and Napoleon met to hammer out agreements between them. And then he also met with Frederick William III, like the king of Prussia as well. And what it did was it forced the Russians to align with France, to become an ally against the British at this point. It also allowed the Russians to kind of free them up in the east if they want to fight, I think, the Ottoman Empire or something like that. But it kind of created their spheres of influence, where Napoleon would control Central Europe and France, and then Russia would control the east, basically. Oh, another thing that's famous about the Peace of Tilsit was it also created these buffer states that were there. I didn't want to talk about. Kingdom Westphalia was created in Western Germany, which he put his brother on the throne of it, which was Jerome. Jerome Bonaparte was put in power there. The Duchy of Warsaw was created, which was this idea of a Polish state that Napoleon believed needed to be in Europe. And so he created that. And then he also created the so-called Free City of Danzig, which is now part of northern Poland today. So that's one thing about Napoleon. He created all these different states throughout Europe, and he even put a lot of his relatives on thrones. Like he had another brother named, I think, Joseph, that he put on the throne of Spain at one point, which was kind of controversial as well. Now, the only thing about Napoleon was that his empire didn't last long. If you know about it, it collapsed within basically a few years after he pretty much formed it or controlled parts of Europe, which is kind of comparable to Adolf Hitler and the Third Reich, Nazi Germany, which would collapse pretty good after its conquest during World War II. And I want to kind of go into and discuss some of the major causes of why his empire collapsed. One of them is the failure of the Continental system. This was an economic plan that he kind of came up with to weaken the British and knock them out of the Napoleonic Wars. It was kind of this idea to put embargoes or blockades on British trade. And so the idea was to destroy Britain economically, destroy their trade. It's kind of like what they're trying to do with Russia now, with that, Russian-Ukraine conflict going on. And so it's kind of comparable with that, but you'll see later it doesn't work. It fails because of the fact that people want free trade. Throughout Europe, you got countries that want to trade with the British, which is kind of a problem. And then also the fact that the British Navy was also considered the big power, ocean-wide throughout the world. And so the French weren't really able to break the British Navy, which was a big thing, that really was a thorn in Napoleon's side. Not able to, defeat Britain in Europe because of that. It is true that you study about American history in general, it did cause the so-called War of 1812 to occur, which happened between 1812 and 1815, and that was a conflict that occurred between the United States and Great Britain, which had to do with the fact that the United States was trying to trade with Britain and France, where the Napoleonic Wars were kind of going on, and so the British started seizing our American ships on the high seas, like especially in the Atlantic. And so they even started to impress American sailors into the Royal Navy to fight Napoleon. And so this forced us to kind of get into a war with them. And so we declared war on them in 1812. And I think we even tried to invade Canada at that point, if you know about it, which failed. And the British would invade the United States. And attack Washington, D.C. And you see on the right there, at one point, their troops actually burned down the White House, the original White House that was not there anymore. The new second White House now there now, but they burned that, and I think they also burned the Capitol building as well. But later, if you know about in 1815, the British tried to invade New Orleans to seize Louisiana from the United States, and Andrew Jackson defeated them at the Battle of New Orleans, of course, January 8th, 1815. So yeah, we did get revenge on them later, but it is amazing how, the British were able to fight the United States and Napoleon at the same time. That's how powerful their empire was becoming. The other big conflict, of course, was the Peninsular War, which was this guerrilla war that broke out around 1808, when apparently it became apparent that Portugal, and I think also Spain later, was trying to trade with British, and they were kind of violating the continental system. And so Napoleon invaded Spain mostly to get to Portugal, but it caused a big war to break out on the Iberian Peninsula, which became known as the so-called Peninsular War, which would last for like 5-6 years until 1814. And it was controversial because at one point Napoleon even tried to put his brother on the throne of Spain, which was Joseph Bonaparte. And the Spanish and the Portuguese reacted with using guerrilla warfare. And so this was important later because it really hurt Napoleon's forces, because he had to use a lot of his main forces elsewhere, not just in Central, Eastern Europe later, but fighting in Western Europe. And so he lost a lot of forces, trying to see almost 300,000 troops were lost, killed or wounded, trying to fight that conflict. The Spanish and Portuguese, especially the Portuguese, were backed by the British. They came in to Portugal, like Lisbon, and under the Duke of Wellington, Sir Arthur Wellesley, they began to give them direct military aid that'll kind of help to defeat, Napoleon later. There is one thing that's very famous about the Peninsular War I did want to mention about. It did actually spark Latin American revolutions, of course, in the New World. And so a lot of the colonies, the Spanish and the Portuguese, eventually would rebel. They start, creating their own independent states, and that's another result, of course, of the Peninsular War. They've made paintings of the Peninsular War as well. There's that one you may have seen right there, Los Trios Mayo, 1808, which was done by Francisco Goya. That showed kind of some of the atrocities that the French troops created, where they killed like civilians and things like that. And so that was one kind of bad side, of course, of a lot of these conflicts of Napoleonic Wars, the fact that there was a lot of atrocities that were committed, but it's not as bad compared to, say, World War II or something like that. Of course, the big thing that caused Napoleon's downfall, as you know, was his invasion of Russia, which happened, of course, in 1812. Of course, considered one of the largest invasions, of course, in history so far at this point. Napoleon would eventually invade Russia in the summer of 1812. I think June 1812 is when it is. And they do think at one point his forces may have amassed, they think, at least close to 500,000 or more into Russia. And the reason why Napoleon invaded Russia wasn't necessarily that he wanted to conquer it, like, say, Hitler did in World War II, but they believed that Russia had violated the continental system too in 1812. Apparently, Emperor Alexander I wanted to trade with the British. I think they needed grain or something like that. And so Napoleon was invading Russia to force them back into, the agreements that were with the Peace of Tilsit, where Russia was supposed to be an ally, of France at that point. What happened was the Russians, they responded with scorched earth policies, where they burn any kind of like structures or buildings that could help Napoleon's forces. They burned their crops and things like that. And so these were policies that really became a nightmare for Napoleon as he invaded into Russia. He found that Russia was a very poor country compared to the rest of Europe. Logistically, Napoleon's forces would often live off the land as they would invade a certain area, but Russia was not quite like that. I think Napoleon once remarked that an army fights on its stomach, if you know about that. I think the most famous battle really associated with the whole Russian campaign of 1812 was the Battle of Borodino, which was fought on September 7th, 1812, which was probably a pivotal battle for, I guess, a strategic crossroads that would then allow Napoleon to, take Moscow at that point. And it was a tactical victory, but both sides, if you know about it, lost a lot of troops. I think the Russian side had 20-something generals that were killed or wounded in the battle. And it was kind of a Pyrrhic victory that allowed Napoleon to seize Moscow, but like I say, at a cost, of course. The only thing about Moscow, after he took it, Alexander I refused to surrender, like and sue for peace at that point. And so it forced Napoleon to return back. Napoleon had to return back to Poland at that point in the wintertime, like the Russian winter at that point. They think that's what cost the rest of Napoleon's forces on the way back, as most of his forces were either harassed on their flanks or the winter basically decimated most of his troops. And a lot of his men, like there's cases where a lot of men, like even, just basically abandoned his forces at that point or were captured as well. There's a lot of images showing Napoleon retreating at that point. There's a lot of ones like this one you see sometimes where he's on his horse and he's kind of suffering like his men is. But that's actually kind of a legend or myth you're looking at there. Actually, he usually would ride in a sleigh and pretty much got 3 meals a day. So I think he was pretty much warm and cozy, as most of his men were practically freezing to death. If you study about the Russian campaign, by the way, it is considered one of the bloodiest conflicts in the Napoleonic Wars. The amount of casualties was close to almost 900,000 were killed and wounded or captured on both sides. That's combined of both sides in the war, which in comparison to the Eastern Front in World War II, it pales in comparison, which is true about that. I think that front, if you know about it, it was more like 20, 30 million were killed on the Eastern Front combined, like German and Soviet forces, etc. So yeah, it's definitely one of the conflicts they think that caused the downfall of Napoleon. And of course, you can see here kind of a little diagram showing you all of the Napoleon's losses that he, of course, incurred in the war, of course, in 1812. And you can see by the time he got back, he had very little forces left. So his forces were just wiped out with this actual campaign. That leads into, of course, the so-called, they have another war breakout called the War of the Sixth Coalition in 1813 to 15. And so this coalition, you have a bunch of forces that combine together, which most of them were Russia, Prussia, Austria puts up forces at this point. Also, Sweden put up some forces as well. And they would fight in northern Central Europe and Germany, the so-called Battle of Leipzig, which was also known as the Battle of Nations, or the Battle of the Nations is what they usually called it. It was fought between October 16th to the 19th, 1813. And its nickname is called that because of the fact that all these different European powers fought. Like, I want to say like 4 or 5 countries were kind of involved in the battle. And most of the European forces on the coalition side were led by the Russians under Alexander I. And this battle involved somewhere between 500 and 600,000 troops, which is considered one of the largest battles in European history up to this point. And you have to go up to like World War I before there's an even bigger battle than that which would be like the first Battle of the Marne in 1914, where they had 2 million troops that would fight France, Britain versus Germany, to kind of give you an idea. Leipzig is very important because Napoleon's forces are almost practically surrounded and wiped out, but he's forced to retreat back to France at that point. And it causes the collapse of the Napoleonic Empire. So the first French Empire collapsed by about March of 1814, and the coalition forces eventually invade into northern France by about March is when it is when they enter the country at that point. And Napoleon at this point tries to fight off the coalition forces, but his forces are just outnumbered. There's no way that he can really defeat them at that point. And so Napoleon is forced to abdicate his throne April 11th, 1814, and he's eventually sent into exile. And the British and the coalition side decide to send Napoleon in exile to this little island off the coast of Italy that was called Elba, where he would be there for about 10 months is how long Napoleon is there. And Elba is kind of located halfway between Italy and where Corsica is. I think it's about, I want to say 40 miles from Corsica is where it is. It's a very small island there. But they let him keep the title emperor, but the British didn't like that idea. They just wanted to call him general. They didn't think he was an emperor of anything. While all that's going on with Napoleon being exiled, the European powers then met at this diplomatic conference that was later known as the Congress of Vienna. And it was this conference where they were trying to reconstitute the political order of Europe after Napoleon had practically, turned the apple cart over with what he'd done. And so there's this man you see on the right. His name is Clemens von Metternich. Metternich was this Austrian diplomat and Austrian minister that ran the conference. The conference met from about November 1814. It lasted till about June of 1814. So it was around for like about, I want to say, close to 8 months overall. And this conference is very important because it creates a new system in Europe afterwards, which they call it the Vienna Settlement or Vienna System. Some people call it the Congress System or the Concert of Europe, I think is another one they also called it as well. And later they call it the Age of Metternich from this time on up to about 1848 because of his influences in Europe. And what Metternich wanted to do with Europe was he wanted to create this balance of power. All the major great powers of Europe, like Britain, France, Prussia, Austria, Russia, they would all be kind of equal to each other, and it would prevent these big wars from breaking out, like the Napoleonic Wars. So that was something he was trying to do with these diplomatic reforms. And then also he wanted to restore all the monarchs in Europe that Napoleon had deposed, which he'll also do as well. And so you can see here, it was an establishment of a conservative order. They were kind of staunchly, against the ideas of republicanism, liberalism, radicalism, things like that, that had been pushed in Europe by the revolution and Napoleon. They certainly were against nationalist ideas, which Napoleon was kind of pushing also as well. And then also Metternich helped to restore different monarchs in Europe. I'll get to it later, but the Bourbons are put back in France. They're put back in power, of course, in 1814 with Louis XVIII, the younger brother of Louis XVI. And so they'll reign again up to like 1830, and he reigns for about 10 years, Louis XVIII. I'll get to that later. We'll kind of talk about what happens to the Bourbons when they come back into France at that point. But yeah, those are all the different goals you can see that he was trying to do with the so-called Congress of Vienna. It does kind of help to create peace in Europe, at least for a while, but also from British influence because of the British Empire as well. Here's kind of a map showing you too what kind of Europe looks like afterwards because of the Congress of Vienna. So it kind of creates a balance of power between all these different countries, which the main ones were France, Austria, Prussia, Russia, Britain. Of course, you see, of course, with that map. There was something he did develop that's famous, Metternich. They had this thing called the German Confederation. I'll get more into later, but it was kind of created to replace the Holy Roman Empire, which was a federation of German states where it included like Austria, Prussia, Bavaria, and others. That Saxony, I think, was in it as well. So all these different areas, countries that were in it as well. It was kind of like this replacement of the Holy Roman Empire, but a lot of historians see it later as a precursor to like what would be Germany in the future. But you'll see later Germany is a country that's created minus Austria, of course, in it. And it did have a parliament, like a parliamentarian diet, which I think was called the Federal Convention. It had a capital called Frankfurt, but it wasn't really a real country with a head of state like others, but more or less to keep peace, I guess, in that area of Germany in a replacement for the Holy Roman Empire. Now, Napoleon at this point, though, came out of exile. That's something that's true if you know about this in 1815. And Napoleon decided that he might have a chance to come back and take power. And so in the spring of 1815, I think he left Elba in February. This will mark another period where Napoleon returns as emperor the second time. The so-called 100 days is what historians usually call it. And Napoleon realized when he got back that he would have to raise an army real fast because you had the coalition powers had troops in Belgium, Germany. The Russians had forces more to the east as well. And so Napoleon decided to go on the offensive and attack Belgium because in Belgium he had the British forces with Prussia as well that was there. There's this one general you see in that picture, of course, very famous, which was the Duke of Wellington. He, of course, was the general that would fight Napoleon in his last battle, which was called the Battle of Waterloo. I think the Spanish had called him the English Leopard, but his troops called him the Iron Duke. And Wellington wasn't exactly the greatest offensive-minded, general on the battlefield. He was more of a defensive type general, as you'll see. And he is considered one of the greatest British commanders that would fight, of course, in the Napoleonic Wars. And the two would eventually fight it out on June 18th, 1815, at Waterloo, which was like a nearby village, which was in central Belgium. It mostly he fought the British forces of the Duke of Wellington. But you also had the Prussian forces that were coming up the road as well, which I think Wellington had about 68,000 troops. And Blucher, Gebhard von Blucher, who was a Prussian general, had about 50,000 troops as well. Napoleon had about 70-something thousand troops. And if Napoleon had to fight both his armies, there's no way he'd be able to fight them, and he would get easily defeated. And so what Napoleon did at Waterloo, here's actually the site of Waterloo now, which is like mostly a crop field that you're looking at in central Belgium. Napoleon decided he had to attack Wellington before Blucher came up there with his forces. And so he decided to do a bunch of charges in the middle of Wellington Center with like cavalry. And then later he brought up his so-called Imperial Guard, and they basically cracked, and his whole force collapsed at that point. And so Napoleon's forces were basically routed on the battlefield. And so what it's going to end up doing, 4 days later, Napoleon's going to have to eventually abdicate again, and he goes into exile after that. So I'll get to it later, but he gets sent to exile in the Atlantic to an island called St. Helena. Today at the Waterloo site, there's a famous mound they built there, It's called the Lion's Mound. It was put there by the Belgians, I believe, to honor some of their soldiers that fought with Wellington there. They built this artificial mound with a lion on top of it. It's kind of controversial because it kind of messed up the field of battle, that was there originally at Waterloo. Now, I think there was a story in the 1820s where Wellington went there to look at the battlefield, like where he had fought back in 1815. He was kind of upset by it, and he said something like, "What the hell they did about battlefield?" or something like that. And so he was pretty angry about it. But Waterloo is, of course, considered to be the whole turning point of the Napoleonic Wars. And Napoleon was pretty much finished. And today, the word Waterloo now means a decisive defeat. Of course, like I said, Napoleon was sent into exile. If you know about this, he would be sent to this little island in the Atlantic, Central Atlantic, off the coast of Africa called St. Helena. In Louisiana, we have a parish that's kind of named after it called St. Helena Parish, of course, today. But the name of it comes from this island that's about 1,500 miles off the coast of Africa. And Napoleon would have to live there for about 5.5 years. He would die in May of 1821. Napoleon would actually live in this little house here you see that's called Longwood, which I think was actually the converted cattle barn that they turned into a house. His rest of his life was kind of miserable, if you know about him, because he was kind of bored. He played like card games and did gardening and things like that. But the thing he became famous for on St. Helena was that Napoleon wrote down his memoirs about his, experiences as a general and, leader of France. And they think that later helped to kind of improve his image later with who he was and why Napoleon became such a great person later and all that. He later died in May of 1821. He was only 51 years old. Napoleon suffered from ailments at the end of his life a lot. And it's theorized that he died of stomach cancer because they think that's what killed his father as well. But I know for years that they've speculated that Napoleon may have been poisoned or something like that as well. But they're not sure if that's true or not. I think in modern times, there's been a few theories that they've studied on his hair, which they found like arsenic, I think, in some of his hair. So some people think he may have been poisoned, but they're not sure if that's really true or not. That's his death mask on the right, of course, there. That's actually his original burial plot, like where he was buried on the island of St. Helena. But later, the French would come back later and dig up his body. And as you know, in the 1840s, he would be buried in Paris, France, in the Les Invalides, of course, the capital. And of course, now today, Napoleon has become this, national hero of the country, of course. But Napoleon is still this. He's got this legacy that's, he's this great man. That changed Europe afterwards. He's going to, of course, overturn all the things about Europe, its legacy before. But Napoleon's still kind of a controversial figure overall. He's not a Hitler. That's one thing about Napoleon that's definitely not true about him. I know he did kill a lot of people in his conflicts, but I think now people tend to have more positive images of Napoleon now more than anything compared to, say, Hitler overall. That's it pretty much on the Age of Napoleon. Of course, later in the week, I'll kind of be moving on to talk about 19th century Europe. I'll kind of get into the post-Napoleon Europe as well. I'll kind of talk about some things that happened after Napoleon is deposed pretty much. I'll get into that. But don't forget, you do have assignments out there overall, like the British quiz that's out, and of course the second vocab. So don't forget about that as well. So anyway, so that's pretty much it for today. Hope y'all have, of course, a great rest of the week overall. And I'll of course send out, of course, later reminders about lectures coming up, of course, in the week. But most of these lectures I'm talking about now, of course, we're going to be put on y'all's second exam. I don't think we'll have a quiz, of course, on this period, but do wrap up the British quiz, right now. That's more important. So y'all take care, and y'all have a great rest of the week, of course. So y'all take care.